Welcome to another episode of the JurisQuestHub series. I'm your host, Cynthia Liavule. I'm a lawyer and advocate of the High Court of Kenya by training, but aside from that, I'm a teacher at heart. In this episode, we will delve into one of the classical hypothetical cases which often forms a good starting point for understanding jurisprudence, the Speluncean case by Lon L. Let's get started on this. Fuller was one of the leading American theorists of law of the 20th century. He's best known for his debates and thoughts about the relationship between law and morality. We'll be sure to return to him in later episodes when we study the theories of law, especially the natural law theory. So, onto the brief facts of the Speluncean case. The facts of the case are based on two leading common law decisions on cannibalism and the defense of necessity in criminal law. It's a fictional setting in a place called Newgarth, and the year is 4300. So a summary of the case is that 4 members of the Speluncean Society, who are basically people interested in exploring underground caves, were trapped in an underground cave. Huge efforts were made to rescue them at a major financial and human cost. On the 20th day of their ordeal, the ill-fated explorers decided they could avoid death by starvation before they could be rescued, only if they killed and ate one person among them. So one of the explorers, whose name was Roger Whetmore, proposed that they should cast dice to decide who among them should be eaten. Of course, the first reaction was repulsion by members of the society, while others agreed to Whetmore's proposal. So eventually, the decision was accepted, but then Whetmore declared that he withdrew from the agreement. However, someone cast a dice on his behalf. And guess what? The dice went against Whetmore, who was then killed and eaten. Eventually, the survivors were rescued, and then, after some time, they were charged with murder. So basically, at trial in the first instance, the foreman of the jury asked the court whether the jury could find a special verdict that left it to the court to say on whether the facts as found the defendants were guilty. So on the facts as found by the jury, it was ruled that the defendants were guilty of the murder and they were sentenced to be hanged, which was basically the mandatory sentence. But then, because of sympathy, post-trial, the jury, because the case was set up in American context, the jury joined in communication with the executive office of Newgarth and requested that the sentence be reduced to imprisonment of 6 months. And therefore, the executive responded by saying that it would await the Supreme Court's decision before it put into consideration clemency. And here we already begin to see that there's an interplay in the quest of justice between the different arms of government, the judiciary, the executive, and most importantly, the public who formed part of the jury. Moving on to the Supreme Court, we had 5 judges who had to decide on the matter. And the 5 judges took different approaches in the case and had different conclusions. Remember, it is a hypothetical case, so it's fictitious, yes, but then we realize that each judgment is influenced by a theory and an understanding of what the law is and how it should be interpreted, applied, and in a sense what each of the judges envisions justice to be. So there was difficulty by the judges because they struggled to determine how the law ought to apply in such a strange case and how to balance the regard and basically the safeguard of the of the lives of the survivors, so to speak. And the case is a playful you could say, a playful aid in illustrating how all of us can have starkly different ideas on what justice demands, how the law should be interpreted, what is the role of judges, and it's a depiction of basically the complex nature of legal thought, of legal reasoning, and how sometimes judges and other legal practitioners are found in are placed in circumstances where they have to make decisions that they almost never create, or they're very divided stakes about the outcomes, and there's difficulty on how those decisions will be enforced by other authorities. So the central issues for determination in the case was basically the extent to which conflicting legally protected values, in this case human lives, could be reconciled. And some of the legal questions the judges must have struggled with trying to reason and interpret about were whether it's morally justifiable or even excusable to kill and eat a human being, whether or not it's morally justifiable or excusable to do it in order to save one's own life, and can that be argued as a defense of necessity of the charge of murder, and if there's any connection between a moral justification and a legal justification for killing in order to save one's life. Another central issue was basically the role of the appellate judges in deciding a difficult question of law, and how does their role differ from other officials in the executive, in other arms of government, the legislature, and if there are any reasons that justify such a difficult decision, should they have public opinion considered in reaching and justifying such a decision. So we are going to delve into the 5 approaches that the different judges had while determining the case. So the first judge we will start with is Chief Justice Truepenny, and in summary we can call him a formalist. He took a formalistic approach. Justice Truepenny supported the trial court's decision, calling it both fair and a lawful outcome. So for him, there's no legal exception that applies to the murder statute, and no matter how much sympathy the explorers deserved, the law had to apply as it is. And instead of altering the law, he suggests that executive clemency, a pardon, maybe a reduction of the sentence, can be provided by the executive. But such a recommendation should be done without breaking the letter or the spirit of the law. And he consequently upholds the explorer's conviction. So his approach can be summarized as formalistic, essentially meaning that although the law can be exacting, once provided in a statute or a legislation, it has to be applied as is. And formalism can be reduced through political interventions, through the excesses of authority by another arm of government, but this shouldn't be done by the judiciary, because the role of the judiciary is to interpret the law as is. And he basically shifts the responsibility, because to the executive, and says the judiciary should not have anything to do that, because that would essentially be a deviation from what a legislation provides. Then we'll go to judge number 2, and this is Justice Foster. He took a purposive or pragmatic approach. So he criticizes Chief Justice Truepenny for avoiding the moral and legal complexities of the case, and he argues that the law itself is on trial. So his first argument is that the law exists only where human coexistence is possible. And in this case, where survival became impossible, the foundation of law collapsed. And therefore, applying the maxim of what we call when the reason for a law ceases, the law itself ceases. He argues that the explorers, being trapped underground, were in a state of nature beyond the reach of Newgarth's legal system. In this state, they governed themselves through a social contract. And this social contract resulted from their decision to draw lots, to cast the dice. And for him, that formed a valid and rational form of self-government. So under the principles of that situation, they committed no crime. And even if Newgarth's law did apply, for purposes of purposive interpretation, he argues that the law should be interpreted in light of its purpose, not rigidly by its own wording. So the statute's aim, he argues, is to deter intentional killing, but deterrence is meaningless when an individual is facing death, when an individual is facing starvation. So for him, like self-defense, such an act was driven by necessity and not criminal intent. He also acknowledges the thing of judicial overreach, or sometimes called judicial assumption of legislative authority, but then he's of the opinion that courts have a duty to interpret statutes intelligently and even correct obvious legislative oversights, just as anyone would be able to interpret instructions to make sense in a context. So he concludes that the explorers acted reasonably under extreme circumstances and that their conviction should be overturned. And therefore he concludes that the conviction should be set aside. Interesting, really. Then we move on to Justice Tatting. Justice Tatting, we could call him indecisive and sort of tortured by his conscience, because he's human and it's the dilemma we all face. So Justice Tatting begins by admitting that unlike in other cases, he cannot separate his emotional and intellectual reactions. He feels both sympathy and disgust towards the explorer's actions, and he's unable just to judge purely on reason. So he criticizes Justice Foster's reasoning, describing it as contradictory and flawed, because for instance, he criticizes the assertion that explorers were living in a state of nature that was beyond the reach of Newgarth's law. Tatting argues that there's no clear point at which the explorers could have escaped the jurisdiction of their legal system, and therefore the law applied anyway. And then he also observes that while legal doctrine teaches that someone acting in self-defense does not act willfully, the explorers' actions were deliberate, they were premeditated. I mean, they were going to die of starvation, and it's an option that they deliberately took. And therefore, the explorers shouldn't be treated in the context of doing this in terms of self-defense. So Tatting admits that he cannot resolve his conflicting feelings or reach an impartial judgment, and therefore he chooses to withdraw from the case altogether, and also regrets that the prosecutor gave the explorers such charged them with such a high offense, and his hope was that the prosecutor should have charged them with a lesser offense. Then moving on to Justice Keane. Justice Keane is a positivist, and he begins by ruling that two issues are relevant to the court's role. That is executive clemency and morality. So for him, in the case, what you should be dealing with is the law as it is. He says clemency belongs to the executive, and the judges must not overstep this boundary. Although he believes that the explorers deserve a pardon because they've suffered enough. Imagine being stuck in a cave, efforts being made to rescue you, preeminence of death by starvation. They had suffered enough, But then he says that in his role as a private citizen, not as a judge. And he maintains that judges must apply the law as it is written, not their own moral judgments. And therefore, he rejects Foster's arguments. You remember the pragmatic, the passive interpretation of the law. He dismisses that reasoning and says all that is poetic, it's unrealistic, it lacks a legal foundation. So for him, the only legal question is whether the defendants willfully killed Roger Whetmore, which they plainly did. So he criticizes his colleagues for mixing legal and moral reasoning, and he defends a very strict literal interpretation of statute. He argues that judges should not create or modify the law under the disguise of interpretation, and he accuses Justice Foster for that. And he asserts that the court should focus on the scope of the statute. The murder law applied to the explorers' actions. And although the outcome is harsh, he insists that strict adherence to the law is necessary to preserve judicial integrity. And as a consequence, he concludes that the convictions must stand, declaring that judicial leniency does not more long-term, it does more harm to the judiciary in the long term. And therefore, it's better to have firm decisions, even if they are unpopular, but adhering to what the law provides. Then we have Justice Handy. Justice Handy is quite interesting. So we could call him a realist, a legal realist. He's a realist and he vouches for what is common sense. So he basically criticizes his colleagues for overcomplicating legal issues, with excessive formalism. And he argues that this case calls for practical wisdom rather than abstract legal theory. So he argues and emphasizes the government and law should reflect the common sense and understanding of the people. And the judiciary risks losing touch with ordinary citizens by over-relying on technicalities. So he's of the opinion of wide, broad judicial discretion, allowing judges to adapt principles to the circumstances to achieve outcomes differently. So his argument is that the public opinion strongly supports the pardoning of the explorers and believes that the law should accommodate such practical and emotional considerations in order to maintain trust between judiciary and society. And he outlines 4 ways to avoid punishment. So that is judicial determination of innocence, the prosecutorial discretion, jury acquittal, and executive clemency. And he argues that none of these exclude common sense, emotion, or factual context. So although he's skeptical about executive clemency suggested by Truepenny, he's of the opinion that public opinion is important and it plays a critical role in making determinations. It's an important facet of reasoning, and therefore realism and common sense should be considered. And from this experience, he concludes that using practical, common sense approach, the explorers should be considered innocent and their conviction should be set aside. So from all this, we see a divided court, and this is the reality of light. We will be able to review the hypothetical case later after delving into legal theories, notably natural law, positivism, and legal realism, to challenge our views from our current perception after hearing the positions held by the different judges. Truepenny and Keane, who were of the view that the conviction should be upheld due to the literal wording of the law. Justice Foster and Justice Handy, who are of the opinion that the conviction should be set aside based on purpose, practicality, and public sentiment. And Justice Tatting, who withdrew from the case altogether, unable to reconcile moral and the legal conflicts involved. So central to all this discourse in the Speluncean case is a strict application of the law versus moral consideration and judicial flexibility. And here we begin to see the essence of understanding what the law is, what its essence is, and it's used to balance justice, morality, and social order. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode of JurisQuestHub, where we'll be looking at the practical applications in different sectors of the law insofar as the Speluncean case is concerned. You're most welcome to share your thoughts, views, to share, like, and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and get in touch through our email address, questjuris@gmail.com. See you in the next episode.